Could this be the beginning of the end for ultra-processed food, or at least the addictive glucose and insulin spiking refined carbs and sugars that go into ultra-processed foods? Well, if it is, it would undoubtedly be a huge win for our health now and in the future, a much bigger victory than just limiting food dyes or something like that, but it won't be without its challenges. And here's why it's making headlines. Dr. David Kessler, a physician and former head of the FDA, whom we recently interviewed, has filed a citizen's petition stating that the FDA should have the authority to remove the GRAS, G-R-A-S, or generally regarded as safe, to remove that designation for ultra-processed refined carbs and sugars. So keep in mind, he ran the FDA in the 90s, and he took on big tobacco, instituting multiple rules and regulations surrounding cigarettes. And now he wants to take on big processed foods, but not just with lip service. So he's trying to create actionable steps towards their regulation. Now, one thing that struck me when I read this story on the New York Times was that somehow it was already determined that high fructose corn syrup and refined starches and maltodextrin and dextrose and corn solids and all these others are regarded as safe. So how in the world did that happen? Well, interesting, the article mentioned that there was a 2022 study that showed nearly 99% of chemicals used in processed foods since the year 2000 were automatically classified as GRAS, as safe, but not by the FDA, but rather by the food industry themselves. A little bit of conflict of interest there? You bet, and it really shows how the system is flawed and needs to be taken on. But also that designation usually means like the substance won't cause immediate harm or won't cause harm if consumed in limited amounts. So by that narrow scope, I guess I could see how the GRAS designation applies. But once you widen the lens to consider the long-term health and metabolic consequences of their chronic consumption, all of a sudden that GRAS designation, that safe designation, should likely disappear, as it did for trans fats. Now, Dr. Kessler isn't involved in the FDA anymore, right? So he had to approach it as a regular citizen. And according to the New York Times article, a citizen's petition is a formal request to the FDA that they are now obligated to respond to within 180 days. But fortunately, he's not, the average Joe citizen, so as the former director of the FDA, I'd imagine his request will carry some weight and get a response pretty quickly. And many health professionals applaud the opportunity for the government to regulate these food products, while others may say the government shouldn't get involved in regulation. And I get that. Having the government regulate what we eat hasn't really worked out thus far, right? But that's the catch. They sort of already are involved if they recognize these ingredients as safe without the data to support that, really. So from that standpoint, it kind of makes sense for them to consider this request. But here's where the New York Times article kind of turned depressing, for me at least. They talked about the challenges to the government getting involved, including industrial agriculture with the corn and soybean farmers, and of course, the big food lobbyists and their treasure chests that they'll spend to defeat any regulation, and how those influence politicians. And the politicalization of health just makes me sick. I mean, pun intended. We as individuals, and especially as the government who's supposed to represent the individuals, need to promote health far above special interests. We need elected officials to rise above the money and the favors and realize the impact this could have for reducing chronic disease. Now, it's unlikely the FDA is just going to come right out and ban these substances, but instead they would put the burden of proof on the manufacturer to prove these ingredients are safe, rather than just benefiting from an assumption that they are, and hopefully prove that the way they are consumed now over the long term is safe. But that might be complicated because are they inherently unsafe or only unsafe if they're overconsumed? I mean, after all, it's not the manufacturer's fault that they're overconsumed, right? And I say that with sarcasm, of course, because the manufacturers make them specifically so that we overconsume them. And this would bring in the whole discussion of processed food addiction, a wonderful discussion I had recently with Drs. Georgia Eid and Jen Unwin. So I really encourage you to check out that interview. But I see the analogy to tobacco being very important, right? It started in 1994. There was a citizen petition to the FDA when Dr. Kessler was the director that eventually resulted in the FDA regulating nicotine as a drug. But change didn't happen overnight. I mean, it took 15 years until 2009 for the FDA to legally be able to regulate the marketing and sale of tobacco products. And of course, tobacco wasn't eliminated, but warnings and age restrictions and marketing limitations have helped reduce its use. So could we see the same with ultra-processed refined carbs? Or can we hope for even more, maybe with a banning of their use in food products? And what will that mean for other foods? And that's something people worry about, right? Like red meat, processed meat that many have been trying to limit for decades. I hope I'm not being naive to think that the limitations will start and stop with the refined and processed carbs and sugars, but one can dream, right? But as someone who's really passionate about health education, it pains me to admit that I don't think we can educate our way out of this problem that we have, our chronic disease crisis and our overconsumption of these ultra-processed foods and refined carbs and sugars. We as a population kind of know that we shouldn't be eating so much of it, but we can't help it, and that is the problem. And when that happens, I think that's when you need some form of regulation. But what do you think? Should the FDA remove the GRAS, the safe designation? And what downstream effects do you think we might see from this? So we'd love to hear from you. And as always, thank you for watching. And we'll see you here next time at Metabolic Mind, a nonprofit initiative of Bazooki Group.